Please use the question and answer buttons to write any general questions or questions for specific speakers. So there's a question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen, so please do use that. The chat's going to be used by CONSULAI only to provide technical guidance and any other information. And at the end, we're going to have a very quick poll just to try and get some idea of what you, as our very important stakeholder constituency, think of some of the policy issues that we presented. So without any further delays, I'd like to introduce our first speakers, Emmanuel Petel, who is the Policy Coordinator at DG-AGRI and Rural Development at the European Commission. So Emmanuel is involved in the implementation of relevant support and tools in order to ensure the CAP is compatible with environmental policy and to promote the development of agricultural practices, preserving the environment and the climate. Since 2015, he's been in charge of the team which manages a greening payment for agricultural practices, focusing on the 3 basic measures applicable across the EU: crop diversification, maintaining existing permanent pasture, and having an ecological focus area in the agricultural area. Currently, in the context of the future CAP post-2020, he will be working with Agri colleagues to promote new greening architecture inside of the CAP. Andrea Furlan works in DG-AGRI in Unit C2, Analysis and Outlook. He's an agronomist with 20 years of experience on CAP policy implementation and monitoring, especially on agri-environment. And Andrea is in charge of the coordination for the agri-food data portal CAP indicators dashboards and working on agro-environmental analysis. He coordinates activities on analysis and indicators on permanent grassland in DG-AGRI. So I'll hand you over to our first speakers, and please do remember to use the question and answer button if you have specific questions. Thank you ever so much. Over to you.
I will start. I cannot share my screen because there is something on the screen. Yes, okay. Thanks anyway for invitation. And
sorry, I was just going to say that if you have a trouble, you can share your screen. Just tell us when you want to switch slides, okay?
Yeah, no problem. Now you have shared the screen. Okay. Maybe I can share my. Okay. Anyway.
Do you want to try and
yes,
share your screen?
It's better. I will. Is okay for you now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I will start by a presentation on the CAP reform and the objective of this CAP reform and which instrument, which tool will set up to handle with some environmental issue and climate issue and how we can address permanent grassland issue. Just to remind on the fact, we propose reform now, I would say 3 years ago, in June 2018, and we put that on the table to have a discussion with the Council and with the European Parliament, both co-legislators. But we have to remind on the fact in June 2019, there was a new election in the Parliament, and the Commission, after that, the new college of the Commission proposed a new vision and proposed a Green Deal. And in the Green Deal, we issue in May 2020 two strategies, one on farm to fork and another one on biodiversity. And now there is some target to be achieved for agricultural activity. Just to remind this target, we need to have a strong reduction as regards the use of chemical pesticide. We need to bring back at least 10% of agricultural area on the high biodiversity landscape feature, and we need to reduce the sale of antimicrobial to reduce nutrient losses, and we need to achieve at least 25% of EU agricultural land under organic farming. It is a key challenge for the CAP to be able to address this target. Anyway, we have proposed, as it was.
Emmanuel.
Sorry,
Sorry, just excuse me to interrupt. You are not sharing your screen. Do you want us to share this?
No, that's okay. I will. I see. Here I share.
Okay, just wait a minute. Sorry for this, but
It's okay for you now? Yeah.
Not yet. No, not yet. It's not sharing. If you prefer, we can share your presentation because we have it.
Yeah, because I will not manage because today I have. Okay. I don't know how to stop.
No worries. Francisca will share your presentation. Okay?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, you can share now if you want.
Okay.
I share, but I have two screen and anyway.
Okay. No worries. Just a minute, please, because we are starting to share the presentation. Okay. Just a minute. Sorry.
No, you can wait.
Sometimes technology doesn't work when we want to.
You can go now to directly to slide this slide. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. As I have mentioned, in fact, to address this target in this context of new Green Deal, we have in our proposal set some objective, and we have some dedicated objective to address climate change, environmental issue, preservation of biodiversity, and to take care as well to animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance. We have, in fact, 4 objectives. In our jargon is SO4, SO5, SO6, and SO9. And now you can move to see what, in order to go in this direction, in order to address at some stage the target in Green Deal and to address first our objective, we have some relevant instrument inside of the CAP. We not start from scratch. We have already something on the left in this graphic, but on the right, I will expose what we are planning for the future when we are talking about new green architecture. For us, it's important to have a balance between some basic layer, compulsory layer, inside of, we call that new conditionality, new enhanced conditionality, balance with this basic layer and some additional measures, more ambitious measures to be supported via some fund. Currently, there is a fund under Pillar 2, agro and rural commitment, and in the future, we'll continue to have that on the top of the new enhanced conditionality. But in addition, we add new opportunity, novel tool. We call it eco scheme. It will be a part of payment of Pillar 1, part of an envelope in Pillar 1, and it will be a significant percentage of Pillar 1. Today, we are discussing on the relevant percentage. It could be 20, 25. We'll see what we will achieve with a co-legislator, maybe at the end of the week, but it will be a substantial envelope. just to say, in fact, these instruments are not completely alone. We need to have a new context and to provide some advice for farmers, to have some transfer of knowledge. In this sense, we have this as well, this new framework on farm advisory services, knowledge transfer, innovation, and cooperation to guide the farmer. Just to come back on the fact as well, the key element in a CAP is to define what area will be concerned by the support, to define eligible area, and in this aspect, grassland is an issue. To go now to the next slide, please. To move. Yes. As I explained, to be eligible for the support, we need to define what is agricultural area. In fact, we have in our regulation three typical definitions: one for arable land, one for parent grassland, and one for parent crop. As regard parent grassland and parent pasture, we will have a definition. We have already a definition today, and we will at the end repeat more or less the same framework, just to insist on the fact when we define parent grassland, we try to make a difference between what is arable land against parent grassland. And for us, parent grassland, where you have grass, cultivate grass or natural self-seed grass, but this grass has to stay at least 5 years and not be included in a crop rotation. We have as well an option. So that means there is no change of grass. There is a continuation of grass on this land. At some stage, we classify this land as parent grassland. But at some stage, member state can as well define a criteria of plowing up. That means to say, as soon as you have a plowing up, you break this succession during the 5 years. If you have a temporary grassland and you plow temporary grassland and you change the coverage, you pass from grass to clover, that means you interrupt the 5 years. That means you cannot classify this land as parent grassland. In the definition, we include as well the possibility to recognize on the fact on parent grassland there is as well also shrubs or trees. It's just to recognize agropastoralism or agroforestry in this way. We try to include that in the definition in order to consider different situations in some member states and to recognize different types of parent grassland. I will not insist, it's just to say where we are, what we want to include as a parent grassland. As to move now. As I explained, there is in a green architecture, there is some basic layer under conditionality. And if we go in detail, we have some standard. We call this standard GAEC, Good Agricultural Environmental Condition. And this GAEC has some labeling. They will need to be defined by member state, but we try to cover a different topic. Based on this GAEC, there is some GAEC which will address directly parent grassland issue. It's just to remind of the fact we will have a GAEC 1. It's not completely new, but we impose a monitoring of grassland at member state level to avoid a big decrease of parent grassland. We will have as well GAEC 10 is just to have a strict ban of plowing up of parent grassland under Natura 2000. this permanent grassland has to be designed by member state. Now we can move up for the next slide. To come back more in detail, where we have some possibility for extra support above conditionality, we have eco-scheme and agro-environmental commitment. It's just a table to compare with both schemes. There will be similarity as regards the practice to be involved, but there is some singularity as regards the administrative mechanism. Just to say, Pillar 1 is eco-scheme and Pillar 2 is rural development. In fact, there is some difference. In fact, eco-scheme will focus on farmer, real farmer. Instead of ICM, you could have all potential beneficiary. And on eco-scheme, will focus on eligible hectare to direct payment, while in ICM, you have more large possibility to cover other type of area. After we consider, in fact, eco-scheme, we are more in annual payment, but we cannot exclude multi-annual payment. And in eco-scheme, we will have a compensation as it is in ICM, but we will have an incentivized payment top-up. Just to move up now to the next slide, just to say, in the future, is a key element, we'll ask member state to design a CAP plan. This CAP plan will cover all pillars, all instruments inside of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And we start by a SWOT analysis at member state level and regional level, just to identify and to prioritize the needs from the member state. After that, based on that, member state will have the duty to define an intervention strategy, and as regards the green architecture, to have a good combination between the conditionality, the GAC, and the selection of intervention and financial allocation inside of the Pillar 2 or Pillar 1 for eco-scheme. And member states have to plan the relevant target to be achieved in terms of number of hectares concerned, number of the farmer concerned, is a general framework. It's important to say we will monitor that, and we are today in dialogue with member states to set up this plan. We can move up now. When we are talking eco-scheme, Pillar 2 measure, member state ask what you will have behind this such support with such intervention, and it was a question for eco-scheme due to the fact eco-scheme is a new instrument. The Commission has already communicated what we can consider under eco-scheme. Would be valid as well for ICM, and we have recently published a list of relevant practice in January by internet. Just to come back at that, we outline practice already established under EU policy, like organic farming or integrated pest management practice, but other type of practice. And we underline the fact there is some holistic practice like agroecology, agroforestry, high nature value, and carbon farming. We have already spot this practice under the both strategy. So just to go down now in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, and in this list of the practice, I didn't take all sub-practice, but I have kept some practice relevant for the parent grassland management. Under agroecology, we have put a low-intensity grass-based livestock system, mixed species of parent grassland for biodiversity purpose. On carbon farming, we underline the fact it's important to to maintain permagrassland, to establish permagrassland, to have extensive use of permagrassland. The same on agroforestry. We recognize the fact would have establishment and maintenance of high biodiversity silvo-pastoralist system. Just this, it is a list of practice. Anyway, it's just to guide the discussion inside of member states when they will plan some intervention. Next slide, please. Yes, here I will not go in detail, just we provide some slides like that to member states at some stage in the discussion to show how to make a nice combination between conditionality and GAG, relevant GAG here for permagrassland, and other intervention on the eco scheme under Pillar 2, where there is some possibility to go further step above GAG, and to, in a way, to encourage member state and at some stage farmer to use as much possible grassland, to have a conversion of arable land to grassland, to have a temporary grassland in crop rotation, to have as well some, in some cases and some situation, management commitment for extensive livestock rearing. Now I will not develop more the new green architecture and how we can design this new green architecture in member state. I will let Andrea to take the floor to present how we envisage to have a good monitoring on this development inside of permagrassland.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Please, the next slide. I will talk about basically what we do in the Commission to monitor and to evaluate all the different policy measures that Emmanuel was talking about. So especially, of course, I will focus on grassland. Our key source is the crop production annual statistic from Eurostat. This is the basic view we have of the areas at EU and member state level, and we use it as a context indicator for the CAP. Is the base for our outlook estimations also. So the outlook estimation are the way we forecast the trends in markets for the next 10 years, basically. And what we see, also to recall what was said in the previous webinar, where a time span of 50 years was taken to see the trends in permanent grassland, we can see from this statistic a substantial stability at EU level in latest year. But we have to acknowledge as well that there are very different dynamics at member state and also regional level. So I will talk about this later with the picture as well. So another important point that we learn from the greening management especially is that it's not enough to focus on permanent grassland, but we need an idea of the grassland system, meaning including also land-laying fallow areas and trends and temporary grassland, because these land uses become permanent grassland if they stay on the ground for more than 5 years. Then another work stream, which is quite important, is the fact that Eurostat is reorganizing a bit the different regulation on statistics. So now we are discussing on this SAIO, which is a new regulation on statistics for agricultural input and output, which merge crop production, so the statistic I was talking before, with others, and especially there will be a specific module where we will try to focus more on the age of grassland, which is a very good proxy for both the intensity and the ecosystem value. Another key source is LUCAS, which is a land use and land cover survey undertaken already for several years. It is a field survey at point level conducted every 3 years and is managed by Eurostat now even with the closer coordination with the other DGs. So in the 2018, which is the last available survey, there was a methodological pilot on grassland to test the methodology and improve it. And now there will be a rollout of this methodology in the next survey, which will be next spring, on 20,000 points, plus an extended grassland, meaning few information on grassland on all points in Lucas, which are around 400,000. This specific survey on grassland will gather data on a vegetation transit at field level. So I indicated there the data that will be taken, for instance, key species, vigor, the percentage of legumes, etc. And the presence of woody elements, which is quite important, as Emmanuel said, related to the definition. And we are also doing some other extraction on land cover and land use data still from Lucas from the previous surveys to find the probability of the presence of grassland at geographical level and better area estimations. So basically, Lucas will be used to get more qualitative information, while now we have more quantitative information from Eurostat statistics. So if you put the next slide, please. Another potential source is this European Monitoring on Biodiversity in Agricultural Landscape called EMBAL. This is a survey managed by DG Environment, and there should be a rollout in the next year. Is linked in a way to Lucas grassland, so more or less the information are the same that are got, but this is based on plots, not on points. And inside the plot, all the elements between the parcels, so the crops and the landscape element will be mapped. So this will help to have further information on quality. If you can go to the next slide. So now I talk about context information. Now I will pass on implementation information. Basically, we have these two obligations in greening that will be transferred to the next guide for the next period on the permanent grassland ratio and environmentally sensitive permanent grassland. So the aim of this is to keep the grassland in place, and basically we get hectares of permanent grassland under this obligation with the further data in case of environmentally sensitive permanent grassland, which will become GAIC 10. Of the designation of the areas from the authorities, from the member state. So if you see the map, this is an example taken from the greening evaluation, which is available on the Europa website, so on internet, of the different trends that you have at territorial level on the basically the permanent grassland ratio. So you see in red areas where the...
Please, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I finished. In red, you see areas where the grassland is tend to decrease, and in green, the one that where the grassland tend to increase at territorial level. This was my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I've got one quick question that's come through on the chat just for now, and that is, do you anticipate any issues with having different types of permanent grassland in different EU member states? Emmanuel?
Yes, we can anticipate, but anyway, we have to take in board. There is anyway some different system in across member states. We want to take in account agropastoralism, and we know there is some local issue, and the definition is, I think, try to address that. And each time there is some specificity, and we try to encompass as much as possible different situation. And as regards the plowing up, after is an issue, but we consider, in fact, if it depends what purpose we are, what we are looking for, but in our system, we have as well the issue of carbon sequestration, and we are aware as soon as you blow up, you release CO2, and for us is a key indicators. And under the ratio, we want to measure, to assess, in fact, the situation of the permanent grassland. And as we know, sometimes there is temporary grassland, and temporary grassland are used more intensively. And by using this temporary grassland, you plow up at some stage. So we can understand at some stage the farmer situation. Some farmers prefer to keep temporary grassland for the breeding purpose, and they want to avoid sometimes to be classified as permanent grassland. That means we let a little bit this criteria depending on the situation in some territory. We need to assume at some stage it's important to have still, it depends on the angle, to have some livestock, but to have some livestock in the future based on the grassland, grass-based feeding, and we try to accommodate the different situation by this definition.
Thank you very much. In view of the time, Andrea, do you have anything to add very quickly?
No, maybe just a remark, the fact that the definition can be adopted by the member state, which by the way is already the case now because there is quite a leeway to do it, helps them to make it more fit in the context. So for instance, in Mediterranean countries, we know it was said also in the previous webinar that grassland are quite diverse. So there is particularly important to include trees and shrubs and to have more targeted definitions.
Okay, thank you. So we'll come back to any additional questions at the end of the session. So thank you, Emmanuel and Andrea, very much indeed. That was wonderful, and I guess we're getting greener. So our next speaker is John Elliott, and John is going to talk about economic drivers of change in European permanent grasslands. So John is Consulting Director at ICF, and he is a senior agricultural economist with over 25 years of experience of policy research and evaluation. He has extensive knowledge of European agriculture and the themes of farm productivity, environmental impact, and social impact. And John led the systematic review of economic drivers of change in the Super G project, as well as contributing to other tasks in the project. And can I encourage everyone to ask their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Thank you. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Lynn, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm going to speak for around 15 minutes on the systematic review that was undertaken as part of the Super G project around economic drivers of change in permanent grasslands. Now, this is in recognition of the fact that there are policy challenges in this area, and I think the previous talk alluded to the fact that policy continues to develop to protect permanent grasslands. Okay, the research objectives that we had for our work was defined through these four key objectives. Firstly, what is the role of economic drivers in shaping the management of EU grassland systems? What are the tipping points for land use change and practice change? So when things do change, where are the critical degrees of that? What is the role of public policy in shaping the economics of PG farming systems? And finally, to what extent do the above vary across different member states and by geographic zones, and also over time? So this is a changing thing. Okay, and for the systematic review, we used quite a strict process of searches. We used 3 search engines and a set of search terms that initially came up with over 3,000 papers. These are papers that we were looking for with the relevant subjects and met some other criteria. But actually, when we got to applying those other criteria, particularly the presence of empirical data and so on, that list went down to just over 50 papers that were relevant to the questions that we were asking. So those were reviewed, and they form the basis for the evidence that we used. Okay. One of the challenges for policy, again, I alluded to before, is that while permanent grassland is very important at a European level, it's roughly 1/3 of the total agricultural area. That varies tremendously across individual member states. And this is just a graphic that shows in the dark blue the permanent grassland percentage, which goes from a very low level over in the left, up to over 70% for the UK and Ireland. So and the graph, the little circles along the top are about the intensity of use of all grassland, that's temporary and permanent, and it shows that there's also a diversity there. So for policy to be able to address this very varying situations for permanent grassland is something of a challenge, and that will become clear. The other key bit of context is that we have been losing permanent grasslands in Europe over an extended period of time. So in the period from the 1960s, around half of all semi-natural grasslands were lost. And that coincided with a particular period of intensification of farming in the 70s and 80s, but that has continued. And even since measures have been put in place by the Commission to try and maintain and protect permanent grassland, that loss has continued. So in the last decade, this was the European Court of Auditors report in 2017. So they looked back over a decade and found that there had been a loss, an estimated loss of more than 3 million hectares. That's from a total of around 60 million hectares. So still a substantive loss. And that is the concern, if you like, of this work. In terms of the drivers for that loss, there are a number. This is from a 2014 publication around causes of grassland loss, and you can see there are a range of factors, including development, urbanization, but also these two, particularly the ones that I've highlighted, which are conversion from pasture to arable, which represents around 1/3 of all loss of PG, and withdrawal of farming, in other words, abandonment, which is 17%. So all of these are of concern, but obviously the ones that I've highlighted are the ones that we've focused on. Okay, and across the review, when we looked at the evidence, there were a number of themes. The three themes in green here, market drivers, policy drivers, and diversification and technology, are issues that we looked at in detail and found evidence, and I'll present some findings from those in turn. The fourth, which is the socio-cultural drivers, is not addressed directly in this work and what I'm reporting or what's been written up, but is important and will be addressed in the next talk. And this alludes to the fact that although economics does drive land use and land management practices, those choices are taken by individuals, farmers and land managers, and they are the extent to how they respond to the economic signals or policy signals is driven by their own personal perspective on what has been done traditionally, what their aspirations are, and so on. So the role of people and people's behavior in this shouldn't be overlooked. As I say, it will be addressed in the next talk. Okay, so if we look at what the evidence said around markets, markets obviously operate to allocate resources, and they tend over a period of time in mature markets like food to drive prices down. And as prices reduce and costs go up, there's an incentive for farmers to intensify their land use so that they get more production, if you like, with the help of technology and so on from the same area of land to compensate for that changing market signals. And there is evidence that that has happened, despite the other drivers out there, that there has been intensification of dairy systems, and that's a particular threat to grassland biodiversity. Another finding was that although markets for food are very important, farmers have also found other ways to respond to those by looking for additional sources of income. This is effectively working off farm and diversifying and so on. And that's more the case in less favoured areas and mountain areas. And that means that policy has to account for those responses as well, and some of the opportunities that lie with those. And on that same point, to some extent, one of the values, societal values of semi-natural grasslands is the landscape character that they provide, and the extent to which that is important for other sectors such as tourism. And again, that's an important part of a policy response to this pressure that markets provide. And so therefore markets are also providing other opportunities. And slightly aligned with that as well, where food is produced in characterful landscapes that consumers recognize, there are also opportunities to brand and label produce as being produced in those areas, maybe to certain standards, and that can attract premiums. So you have a commodity market for food, and then you have these other opportunities that grassland farmers can respond to. The second theme we looked at was policy, and obviously we've just been talking about the CAP and how it is evolving to try and address some of the challenges that face grasslands in particular. CAP payments are a very important element of farming incomes more generally, but particularly so in grassland systems, and are often represent more than 50%, more than half of incomes. And that leads us to two possibilities. One is that we can't remove those payments, or that they will create problems, or that there's a great deal of leverage for policymakers in terms of what farmers and land managers are asked to do in return for that support. Studies which have looked at the removal of subsidies suggest that you would get the two sort of extreme risks to grassland. In other words, intensification on more productive land, or land abandonment where people couldn't make money from producing food or other opportunities, and would just stop farming the land. So the response here is certainly can't be simple. The camp greening measures, which were introduced to protect overall grassland, permanent grassland area in Europe, have not been entirely effective in doing so, and I think that is why the Commission is continuing to look at ways to make that more effective. And one of the challenges there is that it's been set at a territorial level rather than a farm level. This is looking historically to the current cap, and as such, people can continue to receive the payments while staying within the rules, but either intensifying or cultivating permanent grassland at farm level. The other element of the CAP, of course, are the agri-environment schemes, and there is evidence that these can be very important for grassland areas in terms of maintaining sustainability. And again, work continues to improve those in terms of how they perform. So it's a very active area. We know that the whole area of support is important, and the policy continues to need to be refined really to address the particular risks to permanent grassland. The other theme is diversification, well, diversification in technology, really. So this is the extent to which people change within systems, either using technology or by looking at different markets and so on. Now, in order to take up technology, you need two things. You need access to the technology and you need capital to adopt. And when you have both of those things, then often technology has been used to increase productivity. And that is largely left to intensification. And sometimes along with that intensification has been the abandonment of marginal land, because people focus their resources on where they can earn more effectively, and they withdraw from the less productive areas. That can work in positively and negatively, where there is less emphasis on more marginal land. In principle, agri-environment schemes can help provide reasons for people to continue to farm, but these policies need to be very coherent for all of these things to work together.
John, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's another example from Eastern Europe where prior to joining the EU, the lack of capitalization meant that the permanent grasslands were used extensively, but still important. But since farmers have had access to better markets, that there has been a degree of abandonment. There are also other policies, so for example, the biogas technology and the energy sector, which can either help to sustain grasslands or provide a challenge and a risk to them. So it's very, very complex, and one of the things that is very key is that a simple one response for all circumstances is really not going to be sufficient, and that much of this response in policy terms has to be very targeted and localized across states and within states. So the highlights here are really that it's a really challenging area, not just to maintain the absolute area of permanent grassland, but in particular to ensure that management preserves the environmentally sensitive permanent grassland, and indeed maintains the ecosystem services that are provided through that. Public policy is very important, both for incomes, but it means similarly that there is a substantial lever with which to shape what land managers do. Public policy shouldn't just focus on the land itself and what that land produces in terms of provisioning services, but should also support the other opportunities that land managers have in terms of quality food, infrastructure, and so on, for tourism, and also payment for ecosystem services, the opportunity for farmers to trade and get value for some of those ecosystem services that they provide directly. And finally, to say that that research is needed to particularly focus on the economic tipping points. Tipping points are really where accumulation of change happens to the extent that something is lost potentially irreversibly. And so in terms of prioritizing policy, that's a very important issue for understanding where the focus should be. Okay, that's all the formal part of my talk.
Thank you very much, John. We've got time for one very quick question that's coming through the question and answers. What were the market drivers that have led to intensification of dairy systems?
It's largely the lack of the milk prices keeping pace with costs, so that margins have become squeezed, and the response has been to increase scale and intensity of production as a means to to continue to make returns and to invest in capital in the dairy sector.
That's thank you very much. That's really interesting. And thank you for such a fascinating talk on the systematic review. There's some interesting policy outcomes coming out of that. To the audience, please do keep your questions coming in the questions and answers box. And we'll try and come back to these at the end of the session. So thank you, John. Our next speaker is Sophie Tindale. And Sophie's going to talk about stakeholder attitudes, the other part of the equation, towards ecosystem services from European permanent grassland landscapes, and contextualize this by focusing on the implications for future grassland policy. So Sophie is an environmental social scientist and geographer at the Centre for Rural Economy at Newcastle University. Her work focuses on using qualitative methods to understand stakeholder systems and behaviours in relation to land management and natural resource governance. Sophie has a PhD in geography from Durham University and has worked as a researcher for the James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen, in the civil service and with environmental charities. So over to you, Sophie. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Can I check my screen is sharing okay? Can you see it?
I can see it.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, thanks, Lynn. So yes, I'm going to talk to you today about some work that we've been doing in Super-G around exploring different stakeholder attitudes to permanent grassland, mainly focusing on citizen attitudes to permanent grassland in this piece of research. So we obviously know that permanent grassland is a very important land use across Europe, accounting for about 1/3 of the agricultural land use. And we've already seen from previous talks and previous sessions that although the land use in terms of permanent grassland across Europe has stabilised recently, there are a number of threats to that environment. And in Super-G, our colleagues had done an expert survey around what those threats might potentially be to permanent grassland. And there are things like abandonment, for example, is seen as a great threat across, a fairly significant area. But there are also smaller threats like intensification that are seen to be potentially much more prevalent across a larger area of grassland across Europe. And things like conversion, as well as heat and drought stress from climate change, are also considered particular threats. So what Super-G is doing is trying to obviously account for these threats and reduce them in terms of creating sustainable permanent grassland policies, as well as permanent grassland management systems that balance the productivity of that land and also its ecosystem service delivery. So, okay. In terms of ecosystem services, we obviously all know that there are a variety of ecosystem services that permanent grassland delivers, including from its production value, its biodiversity, its potential for carbon storage, protecting the soil from erosion, and its input into water quality and flood protection, but also around aesthetics and cultural value. And these ecosystem services obviously vary across the different geographies and the different grassland systems that there are across Europe, but they also vary in terms of the way that different stakeholders and different people encountering grassland environments perceive them and how they perceive the value of that permanent grassland within their landscape, within their country, within their cultural context. So that's what we're interested in trying to find out. And as I say, we're focusing in our work in Super-G on citizen priorities at the moment. We're also looking at farmers as well, but in this part, we're looking at citizens. And we're using this particular model of understanding ecosystem services. That's the cascade model, which many other literatures also use. So it's thinking about the biodiversity and the function produces the ecosystem service that then has benefits and value that link to human well-being, in particular socio-cultural contexts. We're interested in what the feedback is between the way that those values are perceived and how the ecosystem services are used, but also perceived as well. Kind of mediated by the institutions and the human judgments that there are around those services and how that links into the management practices that then come into the biophysical system. And we found that there's a real need to understand this sort of demand side of ecosystem services in order to understand the different trade-offs that there are and there should be between ecosystem services. We found in some of our previous work that this is often overlooked by current policy design, and this sort of demand-led policy doesn't really exist. We know that farming practices should really align with societal priorities for these landscapes. However, recent studies have shown that in grassland, farmers and citizens' perspectives often don't match up. We also know that at the moment, or in the future, there are going to be new policies such as payment by results schemes and public money for public goods, which need a much more coherent and transparent policy process that allow the citizens' interests to be reflected in policy making. We also know that perspectives can be really important for legitimizing policies as well. So what we're doing within the project is we have done some literature searches on what's been happening before. And we found that public perceptions of grassland really focus on maybe just the cultural ecosystem services, very specific special geographies, as well as willingness to pay. We want to go a bit broader than that. We're taking a socio-cultural perspective, acknowledging that there are pluralistic values that people hold towards ecosystem services. We're also linking value and preferences to more unobservable aspects like attitudes. So what we're doing is we have already conducted some local focus groups where we're looking at trying to understand people's attitudes, priorities, and perceptions around permanent grassland. And we're feeding that into a nationally representative survey, or a number of surveys, looking at the drivers of those attitudes towards that landscape. And we're feeding back to policymakers as part of a co-development of policy recommendations with that information. So I'm going to talk to you today about mainly about the focus groups that we've been running and some preliminary results that we have from those. So we have been running focus groups in 5 different case study areas across Europe. So the Czech Republic, Spain, Switzerland, the UK and Sweden. And we've run 15 focus groups with 104 participants. In each country, we've run one with urban residents, one with rural residents, and one with younger rural residents. And we've tried to balance gender, educational level, and age. We ran those online, obviously, and because we did it last year. And we've analysed those results through thematic analysis. And what we looked at in those focus groups was discussing with people how and when they visited the countryside, what values and benefits they found of grassland, different trade-offs and comparisons with other land uses, any sort of problems or improvements they saw, as well as the decision-making process and management. We also linked into the idea that of consumers consuming products from grassland and their preferences around those, as well as for product labelling. So in terms of the kind of thematic analysis that we've done, our sort of first category was thinking about how people associate and connect and how they feel about grasslands. And we use this to kind of construct an understanding of how people understand grassland in terms of the place identity. So we found that these categories, for example, like the intrinsic qualities of the landscape, the different activities that people can do, and the sort of agriculture and animals kind of underpinning how and what people value about that landscape, but also their kind of emotions and their memories and their cultural connection to that landscape and what was important. So these highlighted words here are just the most popular or the most mentioned sort of aspects that came along with talking about grassland. So things like freedom and relaxation, as well as the beauty of the landscape, its variety, balance, ease of access, and this kind of link to national identity as well, and the idea of it being familiar. And these categories sort of came up across all the different countries, so we could understand broadly across Europe what it is that people think about when they think about grasslands. But we also found that there was a huge variety across Europe, as you would expect, in terms of how people construct a place identity around grassland. And we can compare between these countries and these different contexts. So for example, in Spain, the Dehesa is the grassland that we were analysing, and this is seen as a very special landscape to the people of Spain, linked to sort of heritage and ancestry, and people have a real love of that landscape, and they value livestock as well as productivity. Whereas in the UK, for example, there was much less of this kind of place cultural identity, but their values were in the beauty and the fresh air and the openness and space of the landscape. So the grasslands were perceived very differently in those different countries, and that can have implications for how they're managed and how we can understand that through policy, for example. We also looked at what benefits of grassland or the ecosystem services that people described when they talked about grassland. And these down the middle here in the boxes are just a list of the most mentioned benefits across all of our case studies. And so these larger boxes represent where people talked about these categories the most, or more often than others. So cultural and leisure opportunities were obviously one of the first and most important things that people talked about. Then things relating to habitat protection, food production, but also this idea of multifunctionality came up quite a lot. And then these are the categories here. But what we can do in terms of our analysis is, if we just use these red arrows as an example, is linking the ecosystems and biodiversity that people see around grassland, like butterflies and bees and insects, the views that are available in that landscape, the meadow flowers, for example, to the benefits and values that they find around, for example, physical and mental health, enjoyment and relaxation, the identity, tourism, education, and emotional connection. And we've got examples of how people describe these in each context, and we can see the connection between the ecosystem and the value that people find in grasslands. We also talked about problems and threats to permanent grassland and asked people to sort of just talk about any issues that they had with these environments. And they came up with these categories that you can see in the middle here, which actually reflect very similarly the categories that the experts in Super-G, for example, came up with. So that's reduction of that landscape, degradation of the landscape, and abandonment of that landscape. And what people did as they described these problems to us was linked the problem with ecosystem services by describing what they might risk losing if those landscapes changed in this way, and what disservices they might produce. And sometimes this was evidence of what people had seen, and sometimes it was imagined. But what they also did was talked about the drivers of those threats and problems. And so if we highlight just with the red arrows again, this abandonment issue, which was talked about across 4 different countries, this lack of management, people linked it to, for example, risk of losing, obviously, biodiversity, but things like the memories associated with that landscape, the identity that they found in that landscape, as well as things like being more risky in terms of fires or it looking out of control. And the sort of drivers that they identified was a lack of profitability, a lack of market, lack of policy, but also more complex social drivers like young people moving out of rural areas. And through this, we can kind of infer what ecosystem services are important to people, but also what they think are the drivers of that. And we can use that in terms of feeding that back to policymakers. In terms of management of permanent grassland, we asked people how they thought permanent grassland should be managed. And we can categorize their answers in terms of something called a reset mindset model from the literature, which is factors that affect behavior change. So we can see things like rules, education, social pressure, economics, and the different tools that we used were what people mentioned, but also things like management aims. So for example, farming for biodiversity were seen to be important across all the different countries. We found that education was the most mentioned factor that people talked about around management, particularly, for example, people educating consumers about the value of grassland products. And this just shows the kind of connection that people have between kind of the landscape and buying products from that landscape. So sort of knowing about the landscape and its value linked to buying products. And this kind of link could also be important. We also asked about who should manage grassland. And this was obviously a mix of lots of different people in lots of different countries, but some themes that crossed across the different countries were around trust in institutions, the way that farmers took responsibility for managing the landscape, different opinions of the political system and the government's agenda, as well as, for example, market powers, the role of consumers, and this idea of collective responsibility. So what we're trying to do with this information from our focus groups is to try and understand the drivers of citizen attitudes towards these different landscapes. And so we are planning at the moment a survey which will be carried out in those 5 countries in order to validate a model that we're creating around understanding what underpins attitudes to permanent grassland. So also linked to the behavioural intentions that people have around permanent grassland. So things like perceived risk of losing permanent grassland, the benefits of it, trust in institutions, the attitude towards the management of that environment, attitude towards the environment in general, and attitude towards different ecosystem services, and how that underpins attitudes to that environment overall. And we see that that would be underpinned by things like age, economic status, gender, as well as the country that people live in and whether they're urban or rural dwellers. And we're hoping to test that in the next phase of our research. We also want to link into this idea of consumer attitudes towards permanent grassland and what underpins those attitudes and behavioural intentions to buy products from sustainably managed grassland. So in terms of preliminary implications for grassland policy, from what we found from our focus groups, I think this idea of connection to grassland landscapes and its variety across the different cultural contexts of Europe is very important. And in previous research around human connectedness to nature, there have been other studies that have looked at, for example, philosophical, emotional, cognitive, experiential and material connection to an environment and transformed that into leverage points for systematic change through these different scales of interventions. So we're hoping that we can ground our understanding of what needs to change within the system in how people connect to grassland landscapes. And just thinking about the previous talks, maybe defining grasslands differently in each country could be informed by the cultural connection to those landscapes. Many people value diversity and multifunctionality provided by grassland landscapes. And this could have implications for policy that promotes diversity in landscape, for example, and we could link that to citizen priorities. Integrated policy design could be influential in terms of targeting these very diverse and socioeconomic drivers that people have identified for the threats that they feel are important to permanent grassland. This idea of community ownership potentially and agency came up. I haven't described it very much, but it's something that's an interesting prospect in terms of giving people more agency in making decisions. And finally, this idea of understanding that grasslands facilitate a very unique link between citizens and consumers in the way that they value that landscape. And so there could be a more systems-based approach to grassland supply chains, connecting consumption and production of that landscape. So our next steps in Super-G to develop our policy recommendations are to continue with our analysis and survey work and feed in our results to work with the rest of the Super-G project on looking at scenarios for policy tools in order to assess the ecosystem service provision on grassland farms, but feed into some work looking at co-developing policy options with a number of stakeholders, with multiple stakeholders in workshops and through lots of different research activities that try and balance the competing needs of these different stakeholders, including citizens. So great. I just want to thank the rest of the authors and people working on this research who've contributed an awful lot as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was fascinating. Obviously, as a co-author, I appreciate very much how you've summarised the presentation. One quick question for you. Do you think there's a conflict between some of the economic priorities in policy that we heard John talking about and some of the citizen and consumer priorities that you're researching?
Yeah, I think there potentially is that, previous systems of managing the land haven't made producing ecosystem services, certain ecosystem services, profitable. And we're kind of moving towards making that the case. But I think it has always been a conflict where farmers have perhaps seen that they might have wanted to produce landscapes that are more accepted or more able to produce multifunctionality, but just haven't been able to because it's not productive. It's not profitable. So I think there has been a conflict, and it sounds like we are moving towards potentially making it more profitable to manage the land better for multifunctionality, and hopefully we can move it more in that direction.
Lovely, thank you very much. So the next stage in the seminar is our poll. I'm going to hand you over to the folks at CONSULAI to put the questions up. So what we'd like you to do as an audience is to click on the answer which you think is the one that you agree with the most. So the first question, how should semi-improved and species-rich permanent grassland be protected? We have a range of options. Use regulation to prevent land use change at farm level. Target its protection through agri-environment schemes. Encourage its protection through socio-economic schemes, for example, access, tourism, food processing, etc. None of the above, and we have an other approach at the bottom. So please tick the box that you agree with the most.
Okay, so we're receiving your answers. Right now, 67% of people have answered. Let's just wait a few more seconds to see if someone else would like to answer the question. The numbers are still rising. Let's just wait a few more seconds to make sure that everyone that would like to vote has that option. Okay, the numbers are getting a bit more stable, so maybe I will stop the poll and share with you the results.
Okay, so the results, how should semi-improved and species-rich permanent grassland be protected? 26% use regulation to prevent land use change at farm level as part of cross-compliance. 49%, so almost half of you, thought to target its protection through agri-environment schemes. 23% encourage its protection through socioeconomic schemes, access, tourism, food processing. And I think we've probably got one person with the other approach. It would be good, perhaps, if you could type that other approach in the Q&A box, and we can come back to that when we have our final question and answer session. CONSULAI folks, do we have another poll question?
No, this is all. So I think we can move on to the Q&A session. I will call the other speakers to join you, Lynn.
So when everybody's here. Okay, I think we're all here now. John, you're back.
Everyone's here.
So there's a question for John. Do you think there's any chance to reduce the dependence of farmers in the EU to subsidies?
Yes, that's a desirable outcome for two reasons. One is the cost to the public purse, and the other is that I think even farmers don't like to be dependent on subsidies and would prefer to have more freedom to produce for markets. But there are sort of two reasons broadly why the support is there. One is the sort of sustainability criteria that they're asked to adhere to, for which there's broad support, and the issues around targeting that properly. And the second one is really around business viability, small farms in Europe, and the commodity prices, which I think I mentioned previously, which in many cases, are no longer able to sustain incomes on smaller farms. One of the ways that that can be used to lower the burden on the public purse is to find ways to get those private companies that benefit from ecosystem services that land management provides to do so. So there are means whereby if people have a carbon footprint or want to develop housing and so on, that they are required to buy credits to offset the impact that they have in economic activity, and that the funding from those credits can then be used to fund farmers to manage land or to directly provide some of that offset, for example, as biodiversity. So there are ways to do it, and it would be a good place to get to, but it's just not so simple because it varies between farm and the services and so on and so on. Targeting all the subsidy to particular outcomes, arguably, for example, through agri-environment schemes, arguably is a little bit more smart in a way, effective than a direct payment, which rewards people for managing or owning land with some degree of conditionality. The conditionality requirements, I know, are being changed and improved as we speak, but that is a weakness in the system.
So there's a comment from Stanislav Heduk, who posed the question. Thank you, John. I agree that food prices should be higher. They form just 13% of household costs right now, I guess, on average across Europe. The payment for ecosystem services looks promising, but the mediators have the main profit. So an interesting comment there. I have a question really for all of the panel. So perhaps Emmanuel and Andrea could answer first of all. What mechanisms or policies could be introduced to discourage intensification and encourage extensification of permanent grassland management or land use change? So Emmanuel, perhaps you could go first.
Yes, but we have already, maybe based on subsidy, we have maybe member states are able to define some intervention to go in this direction. As I know, they want to deal with livestock density sometime, or to as well to deal with reduction of fertilizer and pesticide when they want to allocate some eco scheme for permanent grassland management. They want to set some criteria for permanent grassland management based on eco scheme.
Okay,
after it depends of the how we will continue on the market. After we need to encourage the consumer to make a link between the product with the grassland feeding, for example, to say it would be not a labeling, but an argument to sell the meat or milk in another way, because we cannot continue. We cannot. I would say implement only public intervention. We need to mix at some stage intervention with some other initiative, private or something else, but for the consumer part, from the consumer to have as well support from the consumer in terms of price to be paid.
Thank you. Andrea, do you have anything to add?
Well, maybe to highlight what also John said on basically carbon farming, which was raised by Emmanuel in his presentation as possible schemes that we see for the next policy. This is a bit experimental, meaning that there are some member states, some private companies that are starting to develop these systems, but are not widespread yet. But is very promising in my view in a multifunctional way. So to have a value for the market, to have a labeling, to sell emissions, and in the end to have co-benefits on emissions, biodiversity. So that's a very interesting approach. But another thing that we didn't talk about is the uptake. So in my view, we should always take in account that conditionality and direct payment cover most of the area, while on the other side there are targeted measures and these new approaches that are more linking to single areas and smaller areas as well. So this is always to be taken in account when we think about it. So basically, conditionality provide an overall protection, but then of course we need a targeted measure, the market to incentivize, and so to integrate a bit the approaches.
Thank you. Sophie, do you have anything to add?
I think it's an interesting point around potentially creating a market for these products. As we found in our work, there is there could be a lot more made of that connection that people have to landscapes against what it is that they purchase. But there's also issues to think around that, about how people choose what they buy in the supermarkets, as well as bigger issues like how much of the product is local and how much of it is national as well as imported, and how people make choices around that. And people really value local products but often can't afford them. So it's about changing the availability perhaps of products and also the marketability of those products as well.
Okay, thank you. And John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a very quick one, really. One of the reasons why I think trying to create markets through regulation for ecosystem services is helpful. Farming is increasingly seen as, and farmers feel like that they are the bad guys. Instead of producing something that's valuable, they are highly regulated and seen as not being making a great contribution. Whereas if they feel that they are producing the things that society wants and values, which might be carbon offsets and biodiversity, it just turns the argument round, and it would be more helpful for everyone if we could manage to get that to work.
Okay, thank you. We're running a bit late, so we have one more question, I think. So do you feel that global trade deals, economic price pressure, for example, and increasing public demands to protect the local environment put unfair pressure on farmers and landowners due to the creation of an unfair playing field? And I guess this is linked to that. Are European consumers really willing to pay more for more sustainable production? I am going to ask Andrea to speak to that first, please.
Well, I don't think there is an unfair pressure. I think this could be also, as we just said, that it can be also an opportunity. So changing conditions can help farmers also to adapt to their context. So no, I see it in a quite neutral way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Emmanuel.
Yes, it's an issue anyway. We are in a global market, and the Commission is aware about that. We need to insist in our agreement, multilateral agreement or bilateral agreement, to respect at least EU standard, because in fact it's an internal policy, but it's an international issue due to the biodiversity concern and climate change. Is a general statement. After for the future anyway, Now we have to consider a farmer is faced to some challenge due to the climate change, due to the biodiversity lost. We need to adapt to help him to adapt, to go to move another way for his benefit, for his own benefit. But the consumer has to be aware of the fact we cannot continue without the farmer. That means if some citizen has some new expectation, it's not for free. At some stage, we have to share the cost between different level with the public money, but maybe with the private money. For me, either we don't pay tax and we don't have any public support, either we pay tax for public support, but at some stage we can complement by some consumer involvement. I know not all consumer, but if we understand some consumers are very active and they expect to have a huge improvement in this consideration, I think it is important to involve them as well.
Thank you. John, anything to add?
Well, really just to say, I think trade deals are often trade-offs between sectors, and yeah, I think on the basis that we don't think that food prices are too high, yeah, we need to stick to our guns on production standards and so on, and allow farmers to live within those reasonably.
And I'm going to give Sophie the last opportunity to comment on, are European consumers really willing to pay more for more sustainable production? Sophie.
Well, I think they might potentially say that they're willing to pay more, but in practice, you know, actually aren't. But I suppose it's around understanding the nuances of what it is that they believe that they're buying or investing in, and what it is that they're spending their money on. It's around communication potentially with consumers about what it is that they're buying and why they're buying it, and also understanding their motivations to buy certain things at certain times as well. So it's understanding that sort of complexity of the social system as well.
Yeah, that's I think that's the last of our questions. Thank you very much, Sophie. Well, thank you everybody for joining. So all the participants, a big thanks to our four speakers. Thank you to everybody who asked a question. And thank you very much to CONSULAI for organising. And just to say, if you have any further questions that we weren't able to answer, I think we picked them all up from the chat box. But we are going to send out a full list of questions and answers to all participants. So if you can evaluate them at your leisure. And it just remains for me to say, well, look forward to seeing you all at the next Super G seminar on Tuesday, the 29th of June. So next week. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you all for your enthusiasm. It's been amazing. Hopefully next time we'll be able to meet in person. Okay, so bye.
Thank you, Lynn.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Bye-bye. Good luck for the future.